First, thanks to Joanne for inviting me to do the project here at the Bell Gallery, and she's also been quite a joy to work with, and she's given me total freedom when needed, and also a lot of guidance. She's kept me honest and on schedule, and that's been very helpful as well. But I really appreciated the opportunity, and it's a nice opportunity. I think the timing was wonderful in terms of tying together a lot of things in my life. Certainly I'm right down the hill at RISD, the resources of Brown University, and the John Carter Brown Library, which will become apparent, I suppose, in a moment when you come to see the show, and a number of other things, but it was really nice to be able to do this here. And also the lecture series is something I'm really excited about because it really does tie a lot of the research that I do into the work, and to have the research, or to have the lecture series happening at the same time that the show is happening is really something I've never been able to do before, and I just love it because information is something that does inspire me quite a bit in very specific ways. So without further ado, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about old work, tying into eventually getting into this project. Let's see, oh, that works, that's good. Okay, going back in time, I'm going to show you images that I guess follow my work through chronologically. And I will say that, as Joanne pointed out, the theme that really runs through all of my work is a theme of loss. And I'm very interested in loss and what we do in the face of loss. And this, specifically, I guess, our desire to recover that which is lost, and our attempt to recover that which is lost, the impossibility of recovering something which is lost, but the importance of the attempt of recovery, even in the face of possible and probable failure. So those are the things that are at work in really everything I do. I do look to the natural world, to natural history, and to science quite a bit as I think about these themes of loss and recovery. This is a piece that I did quite a while ago called The Willing Suspension of Disbelief. And it is about that moment when death occurs, when you still believe that you can will life into being again. And what you see here is, on the left is the overall image. And what I made is what I call an implied sphere. It's a 10-foot diameter sphere that is made up of a series of steel rings placed one over the other. Within the rings, you can see on the right, is a very thin cable grid within each one of the rings. And at the meeting points of the grids are pinned Polyphemus moths. And at the bottom of the whole structure is a 3-foot diameter fan. And the fan is moving very, very slowly all the time, forcing air upwards into the bodies of the moths. Now, certainly some of the moths flutter as if they're alive, but then others are kind of batted around quite violently, and every once in a while you'll see a part of a wing or a moth kind of fly up into the air and then fall to the ground. And I think it's really important to point out that this wasn't about the simulation of life or flight. It was about the literal attempt to force life into the bodies of these moths. And that is, of course, something which fails before it begins. And for me, that failure is the point where the piece actually succeeds. This is the first of many pieces that I did referencing the material amber and the rich mythology that has come from really the physical properties of that material. We all know from Jurassic Park that amber is a material which preserves. And amber is, of course, tree resin that has been fossilized over millions of years. And, but there are a lot of other qualities of this material that have lent itself to this rich mythology. And one of those qualities is that it naturally collects static electricity on its surface. And so in cultures ancient cultures where they had amber, their explanation for the presence of static was that this was the presence of life. And so there was the belief that amber had the ability to give life, or that it was alive itself. So I wanted to draw a reference to that. And so what I did was to take the moths that I'd worked with before, and I worked with a material that is much like amber. It's what I call a kind of immature amber. It's copal resin, which is a tree resin fossilized like amber, but only for about 1 million years. Precious amber has been fossilized for about 3 million years. So the difference between copal and precious amber really is time. So what I did was to melt the copal, dip the moths in this material, and then place them within this glass vitrine. And then you can see there's a box on the floor on the left image, and that's a Van de Graaff generator that is generating static electricity up through a copper rod and into the vitrine. And the only indication that static is there is a little spark right at the meeting point of that rod and the vitrine. And you can see very thin threads in the right-hand image. Those are copper threads that feed the static through the vitrine. And what I was doing, of course, was drawing static onto the surfaces of the coated moths. And I like this piece because there's a kind of contradiction of it. At the same time that I'm coating these moths in this material that might bring back life, I'm also entombing them in a material from which they'll never come out. This is another piece that I did with the material copal, where I worked with death masks. I worked with a taxidermist who, I guess the best taxidermist will actually cast death masks of the animals as quickly after or soon after they die as possible, because the features in the face change very quickly once death occurs. And so what I did was to work with his death masks and then make positive impressions of the death masks, which I then embedded in a mold. I melted the copal material and poured it around those death masks, and then pulled out the death masks. So what you're looking at through the rock form is a negative impression of the death mask embedded within the rock. And these are, again, the copal material. I have a bobcat, a boar, and a human, and they're all actual death masks. And I hung them at the height that they would approximately be in life. And then what I did was to put a clock, mount a clock in the wall. And what this clock is doing is counting down the maturation time of the copal. So it's into precious amber. So it starts at 1,750,000,000, and it counts down one number each day. Of course, that's a time which I myself can't quite conceive of. It's quite a long time. And so what I'm doing, in essence, is counting down to the time when this material might possibly bring back life to these death masks. Another thing that I did was to hang these each from these caliper hooks that are copper. And that's just drawing reference to this idea of the static and the ability of this material to hold static electricity on its surface. And so there you can see the death mask of the woman. And this is the piece that Joanna was talking about where I worked with the coelacanth. And this is one of many pieces that I did with the coelacanth. I came to the coelacanth when I came across the phrase living fossil. And I really wanted to do a piece with that term because I was interested in the phrase itself. The idea, it's a Darwinian term that's used to describe species which are thought to be extinct, only later to be discovered alive. And I like it because of that, this idea of kind of having a foot both in life and death, but also because it's this term that is allowed really to help explain the fallibility of science, or reference that. And so here what I did was to cast the coelacanth in the copal material again. And there's a lot of information about the coelacanth that influenced this piece and the work that I did with it. One of the things that was so interesting about the coelacanth is that, okay, it's been on the planet for some hundreds of millions of years, but there's no fossil record for it for about 60 million years. So it was thought to be extinct until 1958, when one got caught in a fishing net on off the coast of South Africa. And then about a 15-year search for any more living coelacanths ensued. And they're so hard to find because they live so far down in the ocean. They live at about 1,000 feet down. They did find them off the coast of the Comoros Islands, and then now subsequently off of Indonesia. But there was such a frenzy to try to find them because they were thought to, one of the reasons was because they were thought to be the missing link in the evolutionary chain leading to man. And one of the reasons they thought they were that missing link was because because they have so many fleshy fins, so many fins, and they're these kind of fleshy fins. They thought possibly they walk on the bottom of the ocean, and so they thought that maybe they were the species that moved from water to land. That has been disproven since then, but it really created a feeding frenzy when they did finally find them alive in the 60s off the Comoros Islands. So I was looking at the way in which science really, we wanted to know them, but the problem is that they live so far down in the ocean, so when you capture them, you actually kill them because they can't withstand the change in pressure when they come up from 1,000 feet down. And so, you know, this desire to know them was also potentially going to kill them once again, right, because they were rediscovered alive. So I was interested in that. But anyway, this piece I cast in amber, and then I gave this fish mirrorized eyes. And I was looking at this idea of the desire to know ourselves in the past, and this belief that potentially these were the missing link in the evolutionary chain leading to man. And then I really did, in this display, you can see it really looks very much like a natural history display, and I really was drawing off of the aesthetic of natural history museums by placing this over a glass panel that is sandblasted with the skeletal image of the coelacanth that supports the piece itself. And this piece, boy, this piece took on a life of its own. This piece is titled My Pore, and I started working on it in '97, and I guess it continues on today. I have to tell you a little story about Alexander von Humboldt in order to introduce this piece. And as Joanne also mentioned, von Humboldt has been a figure that's interested me for a long time. He was a naturalist that lived in the 1700s, and in the late 1700s, he went down to South America to follow the Orinoco River to its source. While he was traveling, he was doing what naturalists do, collecting all the flora and fauna that he could. He was not a linguist, his brother was, but he was also documenting the languages of the indigenous people that he encountered. And a lot of the languages, the indigenous languages in South America are not written, and they may be composed of only a few words, like maybe 40 words, and some of the languages are unique to particular tribes. So he was visiting with a Carib tribe, and I came across this story about von Humboldt, but he was visiting with a Carib tribe. He noticed they had some parrots that were speaking a human language, but not the language of the tribe he was visiting with. When he inquired about this, what he found out was that these parrots had belonged to a tribe called the Maipore. The Caribs had warred with the Maipore a few weeks before, wiped the Maipore out, taken the parrots as spoils of war, and therefore these parrots were the sole remaining speakers of this language. So you know where I come in, right? So he was said to then have acquired the parrots and brought them back to Europe and told this tale of extinction and recovery. And then 200 years later, I read about it. I had to do a piece with it, of course. I did everything I could, I'm telling you, to try to figure out how to do a piece without living animals, but I wasn't smart enough. So I gave in and then decided that I would train 2 parrots to speak Maipore. And I knew nothing about parrots, and so I ended up getting a lot of help. I found a woman who, it's her job to help people with their problem parrots. So she came in, and she taught me how to make these birds very happy and how to treat them well and keep them healthy, and then also teach them to speak this language. And so they lived in my studio. I had a lot of training sessions in 20 minutes sessions 3-4 times a day. I had a lot of students helping me. At the same time that I was training the birds to speak the language, I was designing and building this aviary. And it's what I call a sculptural aviary. It's about 10 feet in diameter, 10 feet high. And what you see when you walk into the gallery is pretty much this. You see a lot of shadow. The piece is only lit from within. The birds walk around at will within the aviary, and they speak the language at will. So they integrate the words into their own kind of bird squawks. And I wanted you to walk in and just kind of have this opportunity for discovery, where you see lots of shadows. You may not discern specifically what you're looking at. As you walk around the piece, you suddenly realize you're not looking at a leaf, you're looking at a bird. And I wanted that to happen on an audible level as well, where you are listening to lots of squeaks and squawks. There also is a soundtrack within the piece and a water fountain, lots of things that make the birds very happy, because the birds they're basically, they live against this kind of call and response environment where they respond to noise and call to each other within the jungle because they can't see very far, so their hearing and the speaking is incredibly important. So anyway, I wanted you to be able to just kind of listen to the sounds and then eventually hear what might possibly be a human word, i.e. Maipore. But of course, when we think about this idea of failure, you may hear the word, discern it as this human word, but you're not going to be able to discern what it is because I know what it means. The birds know what it means, some of them anyway, but you won't. This is the birds, and this is a video of the piece. You can hear a little bit of it. I think that shadows are something that are really important in my work a lot, and I like the idea that they are this kind of confirmation of an absence and a presence at the same time. There they are, my stars. And as I said, the piece kind of took on a life of its own. I was invited to show the piece in England at the Serpentine, and so we did that. We all traveled together to England, and it worked quite well. But then I started getting invited to show the work in other places around the world, and I really didn't feel comfortable sending the birds. I mean, sending them to England is like sending them, well, not really sending them home, but to a very kind of safe environment, because birds are very much a part of, parrots certainly a part of British culture. But, and so they're really understood quite well. But I really didn't feel good about sending them to a lot of other places for a lot of reasons. And so I started thinking about ways in which I could work with the piece and extend the piece to other parts of the world. And what I ended up doing was training other birds in other places in the world from recordings of my birds and lessons that I would give to caretakers. So there now are a pair of birds in Austria, in Istanbul, and in Brazil that speak my pore because they've learned from these birds. So I like the idea that there's this extension of the language where the birds are learning from one another as well. And this is the Tasmanian tiger. And I started working with the Tasmanian tiger. It is a carnivorous marsupial, or was, that is thought to be extinct. But I started working with it because while it is thought to be extinct, and I think the last confirmed sighting was in the 1930s, there is still this very rich mythology that has been generated from its loss, and there are even sightings still today. And there are so many sightings still today, even though none of them have been confirmed, that there is a person whose job it is in the Parks Department in Tasmania to research all sightings, just in case one of them might possibly be true. And so I was really interested in that, this willingness to try to believe that they're alive still. They were hunted into extinction pretty much, and they were considered a pest in Tasmania. And there's also a group of scientists who are trying to clone the Tasmanian tiger from preserved DNA. And I thought that was incredibly flawed. I just thought there's so many problems with that that I decided I would address that in a piece. And one of the problems, of course, is that this animal was it was not really understood at all, because it went extinct so long ago. It wasn't really ever studied. The people that knew it best were the hunters, and there are very kind of limited records of what they knew of their behavior as well. And it's a very solitary animal that lived in the wilds of Tasmania, so they're very hard to find. So, so I was thinking, so they're going to clone this animal, bring it back. They know really nothing about its behavior, and I don't really know what they would be bringing back, honestly. So I turned to film footage that has been preserved of the Tasmanian tiger. This is the only film footage that remains of a Tasmanian tiger. It's about 60 seconds of film footage of a tiger in this little zoo called the Hobart Zoo in Tasmania. And you can kind of see it's not much of an environment for an animal to live in. And I figured this is probably better than most evidence that we have of the tiger's behavior. So what I decided to do was to use this film footage, take some stills from the film footage, and recover the tiger myself, and using this. And what I did was to take about 5 stills of the footage and then feed that into a computer and ask the computer to generate the tiger in 3D, recognizing that the computer is not going to differentiate between the tiger and its environment, the tiger and the flaws in the film, and the tiger and its shadow. So that's exactly what happened, is that here you see the clip on the left, and on the right, that's what resulted, which is the tiger embedded in the extrusion of the chain link fence of its environment. And here, again, the tiger is embedded, in this case, the shadow of the chain link fence and its own shadow. And then at the same time, I did find there are a number of kind of badly taxidermied specimens in different collections. There are bones, skulls as well that exist. And what I did was to cast off of an actual skull and then cast it in crystal, looking at crystal as this material that, of course, is believed to be able to bring back life or give life. And then I have this juxtaposition of the 3D prints, they call them, and the crystal skulls. And then on the left is a full-scale, again, 3D print, but this time I made it out of graphite. And this is Lonesome George. This is the first of a couple pieces that I did looking at species who are the last of their kind. And I was really interested in the idea that once something is the last of its kind, really its identity is turned over to its own extinction. So while Lonesome George is still alive, he's a Galapagos tortoise. He's about 90 years old now. Galapagos tortoises can live to 200 years old. Really, his point of interest for us is the fact that he's the last of his kind, and really basically he's extinct. So what I did was to get a grant to go down to the Galapagos Islands to observe Lonesome George, film Lonesome George, and I also worked with a conservation biologist at Yale who turned his lab over to trying to save the subspecies that Lonesome George is. As I say, he's a Galapagos tortoise, and there are a number of subspecies of Galapagos tortoises. Many of these subspecies are unique to particular islands of the Galapagos, and as I researched Lonesome George and the Galapagos tortoises, I found a very kind of rich and interesting history that, of course, ties into Darwin and ties into the whaling industry, and those were some key points that I looked to when I made my installation. With Darwin, when he was down at the Galapagos, he spoke to the governor of the Galapagos Islands, who told him that you can actually tell what island a tortoise came from based on the shape of its shell. And that was supposed to be the trigger for Darwin in his development of evolutionary theory. And then the other thing that I pointed to is the whaling industry. The Galapagos Islands were a very common stop for the whaling ships when they would go out for months and years on end. They would stop in the Galapagos Islands, load up with tortoises, because the tortoises can live for up to a year without any food or water. So they put them in the hulls of the ship, go out to sea, and when they were out there for months on end and they needed fresh meat, they could kill a tortoise and eat it, and it would be fresh meat. But at the same time that they were hunting the tortoises, they were also releasing invasive species like rats and goats that prey on the young tortoises and their eggs. So they definitely, the whaling industry did affect or put a lot of the tortoises into peril. So I was looking to that when I created my installation. Also, the Galapagos tortoises are very kind of, Galapagos Islands are a young island, they're volcanic islands, and when you go there, it's really amazing to walk onto the different islands, because you really can see, some of the islands really look like you're walking across a moonscape. You really see the evidence of their creation. So what I did was to sculpt a Galapagos tortoise from a number of different sources, my own observations, tortoiseshell, and then also the observations of one of the last research expeditions that went down there where they realized the tortoises were going extinct, and they sort of were conflicted about, well, do we go down and collect specimens for science, knowing that we're going to be putting them more in peril by hunting them, or do we just leave them alone? And they decided to go ahead and hunt them. So, but they also recorded the shapes of the shells and photographed them really meticulously. So I used those to help sculpt this carapace, this shell, in full scale, and then I cast this out of glass, black glass, making reference to volcanic glass, obsidian from volcanic islands, just looking at that idea of the terrain of the island and the shape of the shell in relationship to the island. And then you can see it's kind of hard to see because it's black and very dark space, but that shell is sitting in the space, so the installation space on the far right. This is the installation at Mass Mocha. And then what I did was I had two video images that are perpendicular to one another in the kind of corner of this large space at Mass Mocha. On the left is an image of Lonesome George, which you'll see in a second, where he walks up towards the camera, stretches out his neck, and then with his very kind of loud exhale, pulls into his shell. At the time that he starts to pull into his shell, I have some large fans up at the ceiling that are pointed towards these two sails that are in the middle of the space. And those sails are about 18 feet high and 18 feet long, to give you a sense of the scale here. And as soon as George starts to exhale, the fans turn on and inflate the sails. So now on the right image, I call this the stasis shot, and it's just Lonesome George just sitting there breathing. And it's almost like keeping time, like the second on a clock, second hand on a clock. So here is the clip that I was telling you about on the left. Kind of louder than that in the space, but you get the sense. And so that idea of the exhale and the And of course, tying into the sails and the whaling ships is what I was kind of thinking about. Okay, this is Martha, and this brings us closer to what I've got in the gallery here. Martha was the last of her kind for about 5 years, for the last 5 years of her life. She was a passenger pigeon, and she was in the Cincinnati Zoo, and she died on September 1st of 1914, and that really marked the end of the passenger pigeon as we knew it. We certainly don't know it today. Passenger pigeons were most famous for their amazing migrations. They were indigenous to North America, and they would fly in flocks of millions of birds, literally millions of birds, and they would darken the skies. Audubon has a telling of a migration that took 3 days to pass overhead, and the sky was just completely dark. He compares it to an eclipse. And there are some really amazing, vivid images of their migrations. And in fact, passenger pigeon, which is oftentimes confused with a carrier pigeon, passenger comes from the French observing passager, passing over pigeons. So anyway, Martha was the last of her kind, and of course that was what I was working with at the time that I came across her. And as I decided, the first piece that I did, that dealing with passenger pigeon, what I wanted to do was to draw a reference to this idea of these flocks that flew in millions, that were just so numerous, nobody could imagine they would go extinct, and just going down to one bird. So what I did was to cast hundreds and hundreds of copal passenger pigeons, and I did cast off of a taxidermied specimen. And then I placed them in this situation where I had them placed on these brass rods that were evenly spaced in the room. So I had 2 rows of brass rods intersecting in the room, running from corner to corner, intersecting in the center of the space. And the outermost rods had the most birds. And then each successive rods, as you walked in towards the center of the space, had fewer and fewer birds till you got to the center rod that just had 1. So it's very hard to photograph, let me tell you, but plus, I lit it in such a way that the birds become multiplied in shadow around the space, but at the same time that the birds become multiplied, so do the rods, which kind of really make reference to this idea of a bars of the cage, which is where Martha was when she died. And that's the center bird, where you have the 1. Zuganru. This is the project which I'm showing here today, and I'm not going to show well, maybe one image of this project, because you're going to see the piece in a minute or two. But I will talk a little bit about how this project came into being. Zuganru is, as Joanne explained, is a term that was coined by Gustav Kramer, a German ornithologist, in 1949, when he observed, he actually made a cage, a round cage or cylindrical cage with a glass bottom. And he put a bird inside, and then he got underneath the cage and watched the bird. It's a migratory bird, and when the bird was supposed to be migrating, he was watching the bird in this cage and realized that there was this amazing amount of agitation in the bird that he then titled Zuganru, to describe this nighttime restlessness that all migratory species exhibit prior to migration. But that was the first time that was understood as a concept. And it has been the basis for a lot of research that's been done since then. The most famous was done by Steve Emlin in the 60s. He's a Cornell ornithologist who came up with an orientation cage, again, that's cylindrical, but has a funnel bottom with an ink pad in the center. He put a migratory bird inside of that, moved the orientation cage into a planetarium, changed the orientation of the stars, and then watched to see if the bird shifted in relationship to this different orientation. And in fact, some species of birds did. And what that told them, of course, is that birds do use the stars. Some birds, species of birds, use the stars, the mapping of the stars, in order to navigate during migration. Because the bird would get ink on its feet and then try to scramble in the direction that it wants to migrate, and then leave these markings on this funnel-shaped paper on the bottom of the cage. And since Steve Emlin's development of the orientation cage, there have been a lot of different orientation cages devised by different ornithologists to study different aspects of orientation. So there are ones that use optics and mirrors in order to shift the orientation of the sun at sunset and sunrise. There are ones that are used where they've shifted the magnetic force around the cage in order to see if birds use magnetism to navigate. And what they found is that different birds do use magnetism, do actually calibrate their orientation at sunrise and sunset in order to adjust their navigation routes. And so it was really interesting, and that's why I did pick this term to do this project. As here's an image, actually, of another orientation cage that was devised by a woman named Rachel Muheim. She's a Swedish researcher, and she was really very generous in sharing a lot of information with me. In this case, she uses carbon paper. On the right, you can see the carbon paper that was at the frontal bottom of the cage, which has then been spread out. I think these things are absolutely gorgeous, and it's really hard to find. All of these scientists will come up with different ways of recording the scratchings of the birds, but none of them keep them, and I just think they're absolutely gorgeous. So anyway, I wanted to step back and just talk a little bit about how I came to this project. Joanne mentioned this Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, and about 2 years ago I proposed this fellowship where I would go down to the Smithsonian and was granted the fellowship, and I worked at the zoo, the National Zoo, with the Migratory Bird Group, and the Migratory Bird Group was in the process of coming up with and planning a permanent display about migration. And so I was able to sit in on their meetings and talk with them and work with them and go on field trips with them as they were thinking about how it is that you actually can make a display about something which is this phenomenon of nature, which is really about movement. So the static display about something that is about things coming and going. But then I was also really trying to look at the way in which we've come to understand migration now. And so I was working at the Natural History Library and the Cullman Rare Books Library and the Ornithological Collection, and looking at the writings of naturalists from the 1700s on up through the 19th century. And migration was really understood, not really understood at all. It was explained as being birds flying up into outer space, flying under rocks for the winter, going into the mud. Nobody really knew what happened to explain the appearance and disappearance of birds. I was interested certainly in how we've come to understand migration, but I was also interested in the idea of migration as this kind of location where man and nature come together. And there are a lot of things that it is this phenomenon of nature where all of these different entities do move in unison, and very much of it is timed by climate and landscape. And so there are lots of opportunities to look at the ways in which man and nature do and don't work together when we're looking at the face of migration. So that's really, I guess, the overarching kind of interest that I had. I also think about the idea of appearance and disappearance and migration in that way. So then, these are two images of Athanasius Kircher, and I came to Kircher when I found out that magnetism is really something that birds do use to navigate, and I started researching magnetism, and I came across Kircher and experiments that he did in the 1600s with magnetism, and was really interested not only in his specific experiments, but also with his relationship to nature and his whole view on nature. So he was, on the left, are experiments that he did with magnetism. I guess I can walk. I've been planted to this thing here, but where he made these glass vessels, and inside of each one of these vessels is this little unit that is actually magnetized. And one of these units would turn, and then all the other ones would move in unison with it. And so I was really interested not only in the fact that this is magnetism, but this idea of all of these things moving in unison, much like what happens with migration with birds. This was really a cryptographic machine that didn't work in the end, but I was so interested in how he got to that. And then on the right-hand side is this piece right here is Theatrum Opticum, which was one of many experiments that he did with optics. So I mentioned already the orientation cages and how optics play into the ways that scientists have tried to understand how birds orient themselves during migration. But what he did was create really a mirror box where he made all these little wax bushes and trees, placed them in this box with all of these mirrors, and then he would create, really what would happen is that this endless landscape would be created, or the image or illusion of that within this mirror box. So that's another reference that is at work in the piece that I did here. And this is my favorite. It's actually kind of horrible and wonderful. But this is from the Natural History Museum in London. And what it is a hummingbird tree. So each one of these is a little actual hummingbird that's been taxidermied and placed on this sculpted tree. And John Gould was most famous for his hummingbird displays. I'm not actually sure if he did this one, but he did a number of them. And it's, for me, the Victorian natural history displays are really a source of inspiration for a lot of the work that I do. So, and this is the only image you're going to see of the piece that you're going to see today, because you can go see it in a minute. But I will say that the installation that I'm doing today, as I say, the whole project is titled Zuganru. I see this as the first of 3 projects that I'm doing on the subject of migration. The first being located in the past, the next one will be in the present, and the third one will be in the future. So it was really kind of natural. I kept coming back to the passenger pigeon as I was researching migration, and because they were so most famous for their migrations, it really seemed logical to make a piece about their migration specifically, and the fact that they were this amazing, again, a kind of horrible and wonderful thing, because you can imagine millions of birds flying overhead, landing in a particular place. They would go to these old growth forests of oak trees and beech trees, and branches would just break from the weight of the birds, and all kind of moving at once. And they would flutter their wings in order to get the acorns and stuff to fall off of the trees. And there are these amazing descriptions of the noise just from the fluttering of their wings as they were approaching that they would hear in the distance. But you can also imagine the devastation that would happen within the forest after they left, and it would remain for months and maybe years afterwards. So anyway, the first part of my project I divided into 2 spaces. The first space I have a direct reference to the Kircher devices that I was talking to you about, and and there is, I will say one thing, and that is that there's a vessel with a dial that's moving, and that dial is actually moving on a kind of hypothetical passenger pigeon migration in real time. And then in the second space, I've created my own kind of mirror box landscape image of these migrations that are gone, never to return. So I think that is it. The end. Do you have any questions? Yeah, sure. Questions? No? Yes. Yeah? Yeah.
Where does your interest in natural history come from?
From natural history, where did it come from? I think it's, has a lot to do with the way I grew up. And I grew up kind of wandering through the woods and trying to, splice trees together and make things, root things, and usually failing and saving animals and all that kind of stuff. And usually I failed, but I think that it was really just kind of the way I grew up. And my mom's an artist, my dad's a historian. I kind of feel like there's some kind of combination of the two in what I do. Anybody else? And I'm also really interested, maybe I said this, but in the way in which we use nature to define ourselves and understand ourselves and our place in the world. I mean, I think that's really the main thing. It's certainly something I did, but it's something we do as a culture as well. Yeah?
You've mentioned living fossils, and you've mentioned experiments with birds. Mm-hmm. Does your interest ever carry over into questions of human migration? Yeah, actually, and that is something that I've been working with. Yeah.
Can you take the question?
Oh, sure. What she asked was, did any of my interest tie over into human migration? And actually, that is something that I've been working on, is looking at migration both in animal and in man. And I haven't found a way yet to tie it into the piece, but it's definitely there. I was also interested in the idea that birds really are this great connector, because they do touch on different cultures as they move from one place to the next. And I just love that idea that they really do carry stories with them, potentially. And that was, Simon Pokagon was a Native American who wrote about the passenger pigeon quite a bit, and I have a quote of his in there, and he did talk about the idea that they carry these stories with them.
And then they come to Earth and they go into air.
Right.
So
yeah.
If they also have something to do with the sea, those are 3 realms.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
When you were describing the millions and millions of birds flying overhead, I actually all of a sudden remembered have you seen the French film Winged Migration?
Yeah, yeah, that was wonderful, yeah.
And I'm thinking about that and how the whole scene, there's really not human interference. There's just all these birds flying, and the first encounters with humans are the hunters that are shooting them.
Right.
And then something about, I did get to get a sneak peek.
Uh-huh.
I walked in right away.
Okay,
so.
yeah, that's fine.
But the way that you've actually skewered the bird onto the branches,
It's true,
it really
yeah.
does seem to...
Well, and that was something I was thinking about. I mean, the piece is not really about simulating life at all, and you can see that all of these birds none of them have their wings open. They're all pretty much in the same position. They are skewered onto it. It's not really supposed to be natural, and it really is a little bit about this idea of this thing that we imagine in the past, and both idealizing and maybe not the kind of oddness of the display. Yeah. And plus, also, Wilson, if you see some of the quotes by Alexander Wilson, they all reference hunting in some way. The birds were flying too far to shoot, but if you could shoot them, you'd get a lot. And that was, so this yeah. Anybody else? Is there, yeah? Oh, yeah.
I was noticing as you were showing all the work, lots of castings
Yeah.
and viscous materials.
Yeah.
So is there a reference to glass or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm the head of the glass department, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there definitely are optical qualities of amber that are very related to glass. And I think also, for me, material and the process of material is something certainly that my students and I talk about a lot, and it's something that we share. And whether or not I use glass, I have a real affinity for the way in which material does bring about meaning and process brings about meaning. And so all of my pieces really do tap into the kind of physical properties of the material, and how they lend themselves to the conceptual composition of the work is important.